Hey folks, I have 3 essential tips for you today that I hope will improve your photography. Stay tuned to find out more. So the first thing I want to talk about is the diopter on your camera, and this is to adjust the viewfinder. So for example, if you, like me, wear glasses for reading, you might try and have difficulty pushing the glasses up against the viewfinder, and I have seen people actually trying to use their camera with reading glasses on. Now what you can do, and it won't work for everyone, but it's worth trying, is there's a little dial on the back of your camera, as you can see here. You adjust that while you're looking through the viewfinder until the image in the viewfinder and obviously the camera's information is in focus, and there you go. And essentially it'll take into account the fact that you have you're far-sighted, and you would just be able to do it without your reading glasses. So it's a very handy thing to know about. It's something you should look at anyway, because even if you have no problems with vision, it's always worth checking that the diopter is set correctly so that you know you're absolutely nailing focus. So the next thing is exposure compensation, or your camera might actually come equipped with an exposure compensation or an EV dial. Some cameras it's buried in the menu somewhere. Essentially this exposure compensation dial comes into its own when you're using program mode and the camera's all fully automatic, or you're in shutter priority or aperture priority modes where you're controlling either the aperture or the shutter respectively. It also can work in some cameras in manual mode where you have auto ISO set. Essentially you will be able to turn the dial to slightly overexpose the image you're taking or the video you're filming, or turn the dial the other way to underexpose it. In essence, it might be, you might have a scene which has a lot of light colours in it where the camera is fooled into underexposing the image, so you wish to turn the exposure compensation dial to overexpose the image because the camera has mistaken the exposure, or you may just desire to have a certain type of look which requires you to have a little bit finer control, yet leave you in one of the camera's semi-automatic or fully automatic modes. And essentially, again, that's all the exposure compensation does. It gives you a little bit of control over the camera's best guesses at exposing, depending on the metering mode that the camera is set to. So it's certainly something you might want to use if you want to use if you wanted to expose something quite high key. You might deliberately expose it by one full stop, and the EV dial would then be turned, generally speaking, 3 notches, because most EV dials work in 1/3 stop increments. So a stop being something like going from f2.8 to f4 would be seen as a 1 full stop. Whereas I believe, if I remember rightly, going from f2.8 to f3.2 would be 1/3 of a stop. So it's the same as closing the aperture down or open the aperture up, or indeed the same with shutter speed. If you make the shutter speed faster and keep the aperture on the camera the same, you will of course dim the display. And as this also applies to ISO as well, because if you have the camera set to auto ISO and you've set to the shutter speed and you've set the aperture, as you would filming like I am now, I may want to set the exposure. I could, if I wanted to, use the EV dial to tell the camera to under or overexpose depending on how I want to play things. So it's well worth looking into a little bit more, but the EV dial or exposure compensation dial on your camera is certainly worth using, especially if you prefer to use the camera in program or aperture or shutter priority modes. So the last thing I want to talk about is the histogram. Now many modern cameras will have an odd screen histogram, and again this is something to help you with exposure. It'll also help you what we talked about previously, which is the exposure compensation dial, and it will also help you when you are operating the camera in fully manual mode. And it literally is, and I'll show you here, it literally is a little histogram. It's like a graph. And the idea is, in a general scene, that you're taking, say, a landscape picture. That's my cat coming along, meowing loudly, probably wants some food. Interruption. The histogram, essentially, would normally, you would try and keep it into the middle of the graph display. And this would indicate that the image was exposed correctly. Not always the case, as we talked about before with exposure compensation, where there are scenes with large amounts of bright colours in or large dark colours in. This can fool the camera's metering. So if you're in an auto mode, the histogram, if it's to the left, might indicate that the image is underexposed, and if it moves to the right, it might indicate that the image is overexposed. And you might want to have this, you might want to set your camera this way, but the histogram is a very quick way of telling you how your exposure is looking. And also, if there's lots of white in, say there was lots of bright sunlight, you would get a spike at the right hand side of the histogram, which would indicate where what they would call blown highlights, where everything's pushed up again. The more you push that histogram up to one side, the more overexposed, or if it goes the other way, the more underexposed the image is. So it's a very good way of quickly telling how your image is exposed, rather than using an EV dial. So traditionally a camera would have an EV meter with a little marker. Imagine my hand's the marker, and it would go one way to show underexposed, and it would go the other way to show overexposed. So in essence, make sure you have your histogram on, folks, and learn to use it. It's a very useful tool for letting you control your camera, not just in manual mode, and quickly seeing if your exposure is right, but also it's useful to have even in the program modes if you want to see what your EV, your exposure compensation dial, is doing as you turn it. And that just about wraps it up. So thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please do drop a like. It always helps the channel. Remember to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. See you all later, folks. Bye.